My name is Nathan Elwood. I'm one of the librarians here at Forsyth Library. I'm going to be one of two moderators on this panel today. And I'm going to take just a minute here to introduce what we're talking about and a little bit about why we're talking about it today. So the panel is H.P. Lovecraft, a complex legacy of horror and science fiction. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, H.P. for those in the know, was born in August 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. After a childhood fraught with illness, Lovecraft embraced literature in all its forms. And after a brief, failed career as an amateur journalist, he began submitting his own short horror stories to the pulp magazines of his day. And these stories quickly gained the notice and admiration of other writers. Many of these authors, like Robert Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, developed a correspondence and friendship with H.P. Lovecraft. They began borrowing various names and themes from Lovecraft, eventually interweaving their fictional worlds into a collective that we now call the Cthulhu mythos, named after Lovecraft's most famous monster. Now, outside of his literary friends, though, Lovecraft never really gained great popularity during his life. He was rarely published outside of the horror-themed magazines like Weird Tales, which only had a fraction of the popularity of their adventure, western, and romance-themed competitors. Lovecraft was never able to support himself on his own writing, and he actually died penniless at the age of 46. Yet today, Lovecraft is ubiquitous. Mega best-selling fiction writers like Stephen King and Neil Gaiman directly cite his influence on their work. His work has been adapted itself dozens, if not hundreds of times for radio, television, film, video games, and comics. His individual creations, like the dreaded Necronomicon or Sleeping Cthulhu, appear in more works than can be counted, ranging from films like the Evil Dead series, to card and board games like Flux and Arkham Horror, all the way to cartoons like South Park. H.P. Lovecraft himself even appeared in an episode of Scooby-Doo as the thinly veiled H.P. Hatecraft. But while Lovecraft's influence is undeniable, so is his bigotry and intolerance. Lovecraft was a man who believed that any white race that wasn't Anglo-Saxon was inferior, and that any race that wasn't white was less than human. Even for his time, the early 20th century, Lovecraft was widely acknowledged to be a hateful, radical, small-minded bigot. Imagine that. In 1913, people were like, whoa, chill out, man. And this is something that modern readers, fans, and writers are forced to grapple with. How do we square Lovecraft's influence and even occasional genius with his despicable beliefs? How do we talk about him in a field, science fiction and horror, that is more and more being embraced and innovated by Black and brown authors, women, and the LGBT? Today we'll be discussing this topic with our panel. I'm proud to present for you Dr. Bradley Will, Assistant Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Dr. Stephen Schleicher, Professor of Informatics, and Dr. David Tortenson, Professor of Philosophy. Moderating with me is my colleague, the University Archivist, David Obermeyer. And before we begin, I'd actually like to let him explain why we've decided to take this opportunity to discuss this complex topic. David?
Right. So the reason why we're discussing Lovecraft now is because right now on display over in the special exhibits gallery, which is towards the front of the library on this floor, we have the Lovecraft Collectors Library, which is part of the Rare Books collection. The Lovecraft Collectors Library is a series of 7 pamphlets that were compiled after Lovecraft's death by George T. Wetzel in approximately 1952. These particular volumes on display come from the series limited first edition, which was a run of only 75 copies. This series includes essays, poems, and stories written by Lovecraft that were either unpublished or little known during his lifetime. It also includes some early analysis of Lovecraft's work and themes. This series is significant because it showcases many writings from the early part of Lovecraft's career, and highlights his interests and views on topics like language, atheism, politics, and journalism, which influenced his later writings that we're more familiar with. Please feel free after the panel to go and explore that exhibit and look at those volumes.
All right, well with that, I'm going to dive in to the actual questions that we have for our panel. We want this to be pretty free form, so we'll kind of be directing them to you guys, but feel free to interject, to add to, and if anyone wants to add in their own 2 cents at any time, we'd be happy to hear from you. So this first question, I'm gonna kind of target David Tortenson first, but please feel free to jump in. What was unique or new about Lovecraft's fiction? One of the things that we should acknowledge is that science fiction, at the point where Lovecraft was writing, had existed in a form that we recognize for about 100 years up to that point, after it was essentially created by Mary Shelley in 1817 with her work Frankenstein. But it had metastasized into something that was very, very different from what Mary Shelley had originally created. So what made Lovecraft unique in his time? What set it apart from the type of fiction that was being written in that day?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was not entirely new, right? I mean, you can find echoes of a lot of his things in earlier work in the 19th century and early 20th century. I would say that probably what makes him stand out from his contemporaries is mostly that in work after work, he kind of generates this collective picture, this very dark and disturbing picture of our world, about our universe. It's this unrelentingly scary and hostile place where we're just bugs in the corner of some vast universe that we don't really understand and can't understand. The universe is unknowable and either utterly indifferent or hostile. I mean, you get a bit that's not brand new, but the fact that he's so consistently and so graphically and creatively depicts this in a corpus of fiction, I think that's what really makes the guy stand out.
And we have a term for that now, that type of called cosmic horror.
That's only relatively new that we call it cosmic horror.
Okay,
right?
so
up until like 20 years ago, we would refer to it as Lovecraftian horror, and a lot of times people still will refer to it as Lovecraftian horror. But because of Lovecraft's racism and bigotry, we want to call it cosmic horror to kind of distance ourselves from that.
So
we may also hear it referred to as weird Western type tales and those kinds of things in that subgenre of the cosmic horror.
So what made him? I mean, what made him unique amongst his contemporaries? Other people were writing science fiction. Other people were writing horror. What did that look like before he came in and really made Lovecraftian horror the kind of focus that people were talking about?
So a good comparison to look at, especially in the horror genre. Think of Dracula, right? Dracula's this big vampire, and if you're Van Helsing and you know the right moves to make, right? You've got your cross, and you've got your garlic, and you've got your holy water. If you know the right moves to make, you can defeat Dracula. And so it's really about having the right knowledge. For Lovecraft, there are no right moves. You're done. That's it. There are no moves. All your moves are just pointless, and you're just about to suffer a whole lot, and then oblivion. If you're lucky, you just go mad. If you're unlucky, you get squished. And there's a story where one character ends up as sort of a living, squirming puddle of goo. That's called the thing on the doorstep. I mean, that's how this character ends up, is this little thing on the doorstep, because that's what happens. Because there is no holy water, there is no garlic to fend off Cthulhu or his people.
So up to this point, the monsters that we had in a lot of horror fiction were at least somewhat recognizable. There were things like Dracula that were originated in folklore. There were things that came from established either mythology or science fiction concepts like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being rooted in the knowledge of science and anatomy of her day. What were Lovecraft's monsters? What makes them unique in the horror oeuvre? Why were they so interesting?
They're indescribable, right? I mean, you read Call of Cthulhu and, you know, he's trying to describe what this monstrosity is coming out of the water, and it's just in bits and pieces, right? It's really leaving it up to an imagination of what is this thing with the face that has octopus tentacles and, you know, the wings, maybe not wings on its back. And so if you look at interpretations of Cthulhu over the years, there's not really one solid interpretation. Some have Cthulhu as this big hulking beast. Some people will have Cthulhu as, you know, more head than body, and it just kind of depends on, you know, that interpretation. But as you read that, the real horror comes from your imagination filling in those gaps that I think Lovecraft is leaving in his writing.
For those of you who are interested, Cthulhu as a creature, as a monster, does have a lot of different shapes and a lot of different interpretations. If you are interested, we do have on our display back here a brief sketch that Lovecraft made of what he kind of thought his monster looked like. Though again, even he probably wouldn't know, because one look at any of these monsters essentially drives everyone who sees them insane, right? Madness is a really persistent theme through his work, right?
Which is, you know, interesting because his father was in an asylum, mother potentially or was also in an asylum, so this worry that he might also suffer from a madness seems to also kind of echo through his work.
Yeah, his father died of syphilitic dementia.
Yeah.
Well, so what I'm hearing is, a lot of this idea of things being unknowable, unrecognizable, and we're also talking a little bit about the things that may have influenced him. That kind of leads into our next question. David, do you want to take that on?
This one is more generally for the panel, whoever wants to speak to it. So we've mentioned Lovecraft's beliefs, his bigotry, his racism, his conservatism. What would you say those beliefs, what role would you say those beliefs played in his fiction?
And if you have examples of times where those themes do play into his fiction specifically, I know, Stephen, you were talking about the street earlier.
Yeah. So in this collection that we have, because it's a little known story, is a story that he wrote in 1919. It was actually, I believe, published after Red Hook came out, but it's The Street, and it's this story of a street in America and how proud this street is, that it's been here since colonial times, it's been here since the American Revolution, and then as the story progresses, the street gets angry because non-white people are moving into the neighborhood and the community has changed and it's not what the street remembers as America, until eventually the street just gets so angry that it literally rises up and destroys everything around it. If that's not a metaphor for what Lovecraft thought of.
That's not a metaphor, man.
It's with that story, the immigrants that are coming
Right.
into the community, and they come from European cultures. A lot of them are, I think we could charitably say, to the left of Lovecraft.
Right.
I think most reasonable people would be to the left
Yeah.
of H.P. Lovecraft. He had a lot of fear of revolution, as was happening at that time in Europe and in Russia.
Yeah, so Lovecraft was really, so he's a guy who is growing up actually pretty poor, but imagines himself to be among the cultural elite. So that's that. He's got the good breeding. So it doesn't matter that he's not rich. He's at least got good blood. So he is among the elite, and really has this kind of right-wing sense of protecting the world, especially from immigrants, protecting the world being New England, basically. Nothing else really mattered. Providence, most of all. So everything else is some sort of thing that's encroaching on Providence or encroaching on New England and making his world terrible. There's a story he has called He, that culminates in this sorcerer who gives the narrator a vision of New York. There's a version of New York it's sort of like the street also. There's a version of New York that is, you know, the pre-inhabited New York, and then there's the early New York, and then he gets this vision of New York in the far-flung future. And you know, New York has been one of those places where a lot of writers like to write about New York in the future. Hugo Gernsback is one. Lovecraft's vision of New York in the future, though, it's populated by what he just straight up says, yellow-skinned people, that is Asians, like in the most blatantly racist of terms. And
He uses
and
the
that's
phrase
horrible.
mongrels fairly
Mongrels a
frequently,
lot,
right?
yeah. Well, the other thing that Lovecraft doesn't like is any kind of like interbreeding. What he imagines as interbreeding or miscegenation was the popular term at the time.
And that's where you get the phrase, the Innsmouth look, right? Because you're interbreeding between humans and the fish people.
So this is something that you guys have kind of alluded to a few times, is his concepts of good blood and or, you know, the bloodlines that weren't as good. And I know that is a theme in a lot of stories, Rats in the Walls, Dagon, Innsmouth. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that and how it influenced his view of the world and his view on fiction?
It's pretty, well, the Shadow of Innsmouth is the most obvious version. So the story, it's the story of this fellow who is going back to a town. I think his family was there before, and he's coming back to it somehow, but he ends up finding out that the people in this town are really weird, and then he meets a drunk guy who tells him all the exposition of how the town got really weird, and it was because of the sailor who went out and met with some islanders, and the islanders had all this cool gold, and the sailor wanted to bring it back, and they kept meeting back and forth, and eventually it turns out that those islanders had interbred with these fish people, and then the fish people come to New England, and they start interbreeding with the people of Innsmouth, and this is the whole nightmare scenario, right? That is, I mean, this is a metaphor, and again, a thinly veiled metaphor for here, human beings are mixing with another species, which in Lovecraft's world, non-white folks are practically another species, and he's really, really freaked out by the miscegenation. The sort of crazy, not to spoil the ending of the story, it's not a really well built up ending. The end of the story is that the narrator realizes that, oh my gosh, I have fish people blood too. Oh, and he's going to turn into a fish person.
There's what's the other story where the ape, the man who married an ape.
Oh, I don't know this one.
Yeah, no. There's a story where man goes off to Africa, and he comes back with his bride that no one ever watches. There's the children are born, and people are going, you know, insane and killing, and comes to find out that this guy probably married a gorilla or an ape from Africa. And again, these very thinly veiled allusions.
That's not even failed. Yeah, that's not.
No, again, but I mean, Lovecraft also uses a lot of coded words in his works, you know, popular works, that today you would look at and go, oh no, this is a bigoted term, or this is a racist term for these groups of people. But, you know, unfortunately, when people first start reading Lovecraft, I don't think that they are looking at a word and seeing that and going, oh, well, this just means this, without really thinking about it in the context of the time period and what Lovecraft was really, really talking about. So, I mean, there's those kinds of things.
So a good story about that by an author we'll talk about later, surely, Victor Laval, is a Black New York writer, and he gave a really good interview with NPR a while back, and he talks about, as a child, reading H.P. Lovecraft and getting really excited by the horror and the ideas, and then as a teen, realizing that this author he admired was a complete racist. I mean, just realizing from being able to understand the stories differently and understanding that there's racism just twisted up in almost every one of these stories. It's a cool interview, and it's really interesting to hear how he processed that as a young person.
And that's also kind of reiterated or explained in Lovecraft Country, where the central character is black, and his grandfather's really upset that he's reading this Lovecraft stuff and really into Lovecraft, and he's like, here, have you read this? And he shows him this poem that Lovecraft thought was a humorous poem about the origin of black people. And it's not, black people is not the word that he uses in this poem. And it's really offensive. And this character in Lovecraft Country just suddenly has this realization of, what have I been reading all of this time, and who have I been looking up to? What is this shock and realization of, wow, this person is horrible.
And then that actually does connect to a real life story that I want to bring up a little bit later with one of our other questions. But I want to kind of come back to what you said about Victor LaValle, where he immediately resonated with the horror of Lovecraft stories. And I think that something that many writers noticed was that this was different, that this cosmic horror, that this Lovecraftian horror was something new. But I kind of want to dive into a little bit more of, what did Lovecraft's contemporaries think of him? I mentioned that there was correspondence, that there was friendship, but how did he actually influence the fiction of his day, the writers who were his contemporaries?
So today we talk a lot about Creative Commons, right? With this idea that I am creating a work and I'm sharing it with the rest of the world, and you are free to use it, adapt it, change it, modify it however you want. The idea of Creative Commons is relatively new, but if you go back to what Lovecraft was writing, and he writes about this manuscript called the Necronomicon, and then suddenly one of his contemporaries goes, I kind of like this idea of this mad Arab that wrote this book called the Necronomicon. Can I use that in one of my works? And Lovecraft's like, yeah, sure, do whatever you want with it. And so through that, he starts allowing people to take his creations and make them bigger than what they would have ever been in just the few publications that he was in as a writer. And so I think that this contribution of creating an open world, or allowing people to freely use his stuff in their work, really helped build up that literary world. I mean, whether it be from Robert E. Howard and his Conan stuff, and references to some Lovecraftian stuff in his works or in other places. So,
now, for a lot of us having either grown up in or at least very familiar now with things like the Marvel Universe, the concept of a shared universe is not unfamiliar, I think, to most of the folks here. Was this a new concept then? Was this something that...
Well, but Lovecraft was even borrowing from writers before his time.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's almost not conceptualized. You know what I mean? Like it's not a new concept. It's just kind of the things some people were doing, right? So, yeah, Lovecraft. I almost said steals, but it's not really that case, right?
It is.
The guy who wrote The King in Yellow.
Yes.
What was his name?
Chambers.
Chambers, thank you. Yeah, Robert W. Chambers writes The King in Yellow, and Lovecraft, and people were saying to Lovecraft for a long time, hey, you should really read this guy's work. And he didn't until one of the last years of his life, and then ends up stealing a couple of ideas from Chambers and putting them in the back end of his stories. And then that sort of drags Chambers, who was writing in the 19th century, into the whole Lovecraft thing. It's really confusing. It's not even, like, you can say it's kind of like the Marvel Universe, and that makes sense. Except it's also just kind of this weird blob of just intertextuality, of just
kind
writers.
of the thing on the doorstep, just a weird blob.
Yeah, just a weird blob of stuff. Just writers referencing each other over and over again, and often in ways that don't make sense, because you could read. August Derleth was a person who ended up publishing a lot of Lovecraft later, and he wrote a lot of Cthulhu mythos stories. But if you read those, they don't fit in. Like, Derleth didn't quite get it, and so all of his stories are slightly weird. So some of the monsters are good guys, and some of the monsters are bad guys, and there's a good team to be on, and there's a bad team to be on, and they just don't make a lot of sense compared to all the other business. But that's part of what happens when you throw your business out in the world.
I want to tie that back into the themes, and David, I wonder if you might be able to expound on this a little bit more as well. When you say that he didn't get it with there being good guys and bad guys, could you explain what that means a little bit more?
Well, like I said, in Lovecraft's universe, it's not clear that there really are any good guys except maybe some white people from Providence, right? I mean, it's just in this universe where, I mean, it's unrelentingly either utterly indifferent to our needs and desires, or even hostile, right? And so the idea of there being like beings that you could side with, or that might somehow be sympathetic to your interests or something, no, not in Lovecraft's world. No.
We often think of his creatures, things like Cthulhu, as gods themselves, but he was himself an atheist, right?
Yeah, I believe he was.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So very much an atheist.
Violently atheist, yeah.
Violently.
Well, that was one thing I was going to point out was different about, like, I've read other occult kind of themed writers before him, and a lot of them were writing with some kind of theological assumptions in the background that maybe ultimately the world was not in entirely bad hands, right? But for Lovecraft, like, there is no God. There's just these horrible things, and that's it. And there's nothing to protect us, and there's no one who's ultimately on our side.
I can see why that'd be scary for people who hadn't really examined those ideas before.
The God idea, so Lovecraft lays the whole God idea at the feet of all those people of color, because if you're a person of color in a Lovecraft story, you are also a cultist. That is, you religiously worship one of these crazy beings that's actually out to destroy the world. So we have the Cthulhu cult, which stretches across the planet. There's in the Call of Cthulhu, there's a story about a guy who finds out he connects a bunch of seemingly interrelated items and realizes that, oh my gosh, there was a horrible worldwide conspiracy to resurrect this monster. And in the story, they talk about the cultists who worship Cthulhu, and there are Eskimos, there are Middle Eastern people, there are plenty of African people. There's a big section about a Cthulhu cult that was operating in the bayous of Louisiana, all, of course, not white people. And one of those people gets arrested, and the police are interviewing him about this Cthulhu cult. And this guy is apparently very highly placed in the Cthulhu cult. And he says, yeah, I've been all over the world. I've visited Cthulhu cults that are operating in the center of China, and there's a really big Cthulhu cult we have going in the deserts of Arabia.
So there's never one in London.
Well, he specifically said, I mean, this is the crazy thing. So this guy, so he's, oh, we got outfits everywhere, right? And then he specifically says, for no apparent reason, but we have no relationship with the European witch cults. So just to make sure that we all know that, yeah, the Europeans are playing this game, because that would be horrible, right? If anybody actually mistakenly thought that a European would be involved in this kind of stuff. But that's how deep Lovecraft's racism goes. Yeah.
Well, let's jump ahead a little bit. David, do you want to take this next question? Other David.
Where are we?
Number 4.
Yeah. What is the general consensus of Lovecraft's work today? What has been his influence on popular culture?
Well, I mean, certainly, as you alluded to at the beginning, without Lovecraft's influence, we wouldn't have things like Hellboy. If you're a Mike Mignola fan on the comic book side, we wouldn't have a lot of Stephen King stuff. Stephen King highly influenced. If you're a fan of Sam Raimi and his Spider-Man stuff, well, you know, his Army of Darkness and the Evil Dead stuff is based really around the idea of a Necronomicon. So anytime that you hear of, you know, this Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon, the Dread Necronomicon, I mean, that's all Lovecraft origin stuffs. So, you know, we have plushies today of Cthulhu. His influence in popular culture today is really, really deep. But at the same time, it almost feels like Lovecraft's, the Cthulhu mythos or that cosmic horror has been stripped away from Lovecraft. Would you agree with that, David?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of they're references, but they're often rather shallow. In the sense like, oh, I just got to mention Cthulhu there, and okay, we got it.
Right.
Or I make some mention of the Necronomicon. I was actually reading one author claiming, and I realized he was right. Ghostbusters, the image of the cult of Zool, that's totally Lovecraft, but it's a very shallow level.
Yeah, yeah. So
why do we keep seeing these things? Is there something about his themes that really still resonate, or is it just that these other authors back then were using it and it just kind of seeped into the public? Why
honestly,
is he so ubiquitous?
I feel like the Cthulhu mythos has been detached from Lovecraft. It's no longer his thing. It got so big that even if he were alive, he would not have control over his own creation.
So we can't actually kind of trace this to a thing, though. So there's a point at which nobody knows anything about Lovecraft, and there's a point at which he starts really significantly creeping into the culture. And we can blame Dungeons and Dragons, because the very first Deities and Demigods book actually has Cthulhu mythos monsters in it, although they had to be yanked for some reason. I don't understand, but people say that there's a copyright thing. There is no copyright thing, but for some reason they yanked it. And then the other thing that happened, similarly with tabletop role-playing games, was the release in the sort of mid-'80s, early mid-'80s, of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. And this was the thing that, so a lot of people who knew role-playing games but didn't know Lovecraft got their introduction to who H.P. Lovecraft was through the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. And you can really see there's almost nothing going on. There were a couple of film adaptations of Lovecraft in the 70s, a movie called Die Monster Die, which only if you know that it's based on a Lovecraft story, even if you watch it, you'll be like, wow, really, that's a terrible adaptation of that story. But up until the release of Call of Cthulhu, there's just not a lot of this pop culture carryover. There was also a couple of collections, a couple of paperback collections of Lovecraft that were printed in the late 70s and then reprinted again around in the mid-'80s, almost exactly at the same time, although just serendipitously. I think Del Rey published a nice collection of Lovecraft books. I have some of the cover art in my office. It's really cool. But that also brought in Lovecraft to the popular culture. And so you can, it's one of those weird places where you can actually almost identify the day that people started getting more exposure to Lovecraft. Yeah.
Well, this kind of goes into the next big question, and kind of the impetus for this whole panel, which is, and I'm very curious about the idea of him being kind of almost divorced from the Lovecraft mythos, or from the Cthulhu mythos himself at this point, but how should we think about and how should we talk about Lovecraft in the modern context? Obviously, he was a very influential, an incredibly influential writer. We're still talking about him. But, I mean, this was a very problematic individual. This was someone whose bigotry is hugely influential on his works. Does that carry on into how those works are treated today? Does that, I mean, how should we be thinking about this guy and these works?
I think he's a total jerk. That's what we should think.
Yeah, no, totally. But
a monster.
Brad and I have this conversation all the time about how do we separate the art from the artist, right? How do we go about saying, yeah, this guy's a real jerk, but man, he created some really cool stuff. And if you look at other popular writers that you probably are all big fans of in the sci-fi area, they have some real problematic politics as well. Some real problematic causes that they support, and yet people will still go out and buy their books and say, oh, let's make a movie out of this book or out of this author's work. And we tend to say, okay, this person is super wrong and problematic, but we can appreciate what they added to literature or pop culture or whatever. And I think it's very hard to separate those two things. Lovecraft just right now seems to be the biggest, one of the bigger focal points of, racism versus additions to the culture.
Well, so some years ago, Orson Scott Card made some deeply homophobic comments, and a lot of people were like, whoa, that's terrible. And they were. I think he backed off on those, but
He
just doubled down.
He doubles down
Okay.
and supports
All right.
causes against LGBT communities.
So anyway, but Orson Scott Card's fiction, at least the prominent stuff that I know, and I'm not that deep into it, isn't centered on homophobia, whereas Lovecraft's work is. I mean, it's not like there's a little homophobia or racism or some other nasty thing sort of sprinkled on top of Lovecraft's work. It's the core basis of Lovecraft's work. And
David, you seem like you might disagree a little bit on that. this.
Oh, feel free.
Yeah, oh no, Brad and I go back.
No, I mean,
We've
the
talked
father,
about
the
this a lot.
father's,
Yeah.
no, finish it.
Oh, so no, so that's in my world. It's almost not even a matter of separating the artist from the art. I can't get the racism out of the fiction. I still read the fiction. Well, I haven't for a while because I know it all. I've read it a lot. But I read it knowing that it is interlaced with, not interlaced even. I mean, it's just
It's there.
It is constituted of a really horrible outlook on the world and a really horrible outlook on other people. Yeah.
What I was going to suggest, I mean, I think that, as you know, the guy's racist attitudes and nativist attitudes and all this, and his fears about tainted blood and all these crazy things, it might have been the inspiration for what he's doing. Yeah, it's. I mean, it is part of the DNA of it. It really is. It's just there. But I think the ideas that this inspired. I mean, wherever the ideas came from. I mean, this guy who, because he's a crazy racist living in Providence, he thinks that the world is this terrifying, unknowable, scary place, and but nevertheless, the idea I think of this. I think that's what people like about this, and people pick up on, is this kind of pessimistic vision of the world as this terrifying, unknowable, scary place. And wherever that idea came out of, I think people pick up on that. And I mean, people do, and some people are actually, believe it or not, they probably haven't read a lot of it, but they're rather surprised to find out, yeah, he was crazy racist.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. Is once you understand some of the coded words and not coded words that he's using in his work, when you're reading a passage from Call of Cthulhu or from Innsmouth, and you're like, wait a minute, what does this word really mean in context of when it was written? You're like, oh, crap, I can never read this story again
Yeah,
because it's so awful.
If you find that kind of word in Lovecraft, just assume it's something horrible and
Yeah.
don't look it up in the dictionary.
Yeah.
Which I have literally done multiple times because of articles I've had to write. Like, what is? Oh, that's what that is. So,
Yeah.
don't.
But again, you know, I think, I don't know, how have a lot of you read a lot of Lovecraft's work? I mean, we know the most popular stuff, Call of Cthulhu, the Innsmouth, Mouths of Madness. We know those kinds of things, but it's like, I think a lot of people, when you hear, oh, Call of Cthulhu, they're like, oh yeah, the giant monster that comes out of the ocean and everybody's insane. And they don't know the part about, hey, we're going into the Louisiana swamp and we're dealing with this crazy cult. I think people understand these themes and ideas, and it's part of our, you know, it's part of the cultural, you know, phenomena, but we don't really know what's in those stories.
So part of the problem is though that racism begins to bubble up in some weird ways. And I'll give you a really shocking example. In 2000, I want to say 2005, maybe 2009, must have been 2005, Peter Jackson remade King Kong. And if you watch that, I mean, visually it's a cool movie, but there's not a lot going on. It's just pretty much a remake. But Jackson makes this one really weird change, and if you don't believe what I'm about to describe, just look it up on YouTube, because there are plenty of people that have clips of this. So you remember that on Skull Island, where King Kong lives, there are, in the original movie, a bunch of people of African descent. Presumably it's an island near Africa, and in that movie they are characterized as sort of the worst stereotypical Hollywood African native people, right? The face paint and the shields and the dancing and such. But they're African people. And, well, let's put it, I'll come back to them. In Peter Jackson's version, the folks go to the island and they meet the native population there. And the first native they meet is this little girl, and she's really creepy. She kind of holds her hand out and she's sort of staring off into space. And the guy, I can't remember the guy who's making the film, comes up and tries to give her a candy bar, and she goes nuts and she bites him, and she's like, ah! And she's just like loony crazy. And then these other people come out and they're really crazy, and then a bunch of guys come out with spears. Actually, he goes, don't worry, it's just women and kids. And then one of the guys who's just standing there in his party goes, ugh, and somebody's thrown a spear through his body and he dies. And then you see that there are plenty of big guys here too. So the way those natives are shot, and it's not like, it does matter that it's Peter Jackson, they look just like orcs from the Lord of the Rings. It's shot in the same kind of lighting. There's a lot of weird like mouth breathing like the orcs did, like all they don't look human. They are people with black skin, but their behavior is utterly inhuman. Now I say that because compare that to the original movie. In the original movie, the audience is supposed to be sympathetic with these folks, not scared of them. When Kong breaks through at the end of the movie, he breaks through the wall and he starts tearing through the native village, and there are several really solid shots. Well, they got cut from the original version, but they've been restored, where Kong grabs a native, he throws the native in his mouth and chews him up. And that scene is reflected again in New York, where he grabs a New Yorker, throws him in his mouth and chews him up. It's the same idea. We're supposed to be very sympathetic as an audience. There's even a shot in the original King Kong where there's this little girl, you probably remember this, she's sort of sitting in the pathway, kind of in a puddle, and Kong is bearing down on her, and her mom runs out from the side and grabs her and carries her off to the side. It's a human move. It's a totally humanizing move. Peter Jackson's natives have none of that, and Peter Jackson's natives are all super Lovecraftian. Like, that's the deal. They worship Kong in exactly the way Lovecraft's cultists. In 33, nobody was reading Lovecraft. He didn't have a presence in our popular culture. In 2005, he does, and I think a pretty bad presence. That is, if you go back and watch that movie and think about how Peter Jackson is shooting the natives on that island and the things that those natives do and the things they don't do, like behave like human beings, it's really creepy, super creepy.
So that kind of all leads into the final question. David, I'm gonna kind of just kind of lead into this a little bit, but so are the themes and the ideas that Lovecraft created inextricable from the racism and the bigotry, or can these themes and ideas be used by modern authors in a way wholly different from what Lovecraft would have intended? And are there authors who are doing so or actively tackling the problems here in their own fiction?
So we've mentioned a couple of them already.
Yeah.
Matt Ruff has written Lovecraft Country, which is all about growing up in and during the Jim Crow era and having to deal with the racism that these people are experiencing. The interesting thing that Ruff does in the book is all of the heroes in the book are African American, are black, and they are actively fighting against not only racists, but also fighting against the Lovecraftian horrors. So whether you're talking about some of the families that they are making contact with, and there's certainly a passage in the book that implies that one of our main heroes may have been related to a white family, and of course that is totally, the hero is black and he's taking down the white establishment, is something that Lovecraft would be horrified over. And the fact that every single one of the characters are going through and overcoming all of the obstacles, both realistic of Jim Crow era time periods and what Lovecraft would have created, is kind of just saying, screw you, Lovecraft. We're going to take your creations and do with them what we will. Victor LaValle's Ballad of Black Tom is the same way. There's another book, it's all fictional. Carter and Lovecraft is a kind of a take where a detective who is a descendant of William Randolph Carter, the real William Randolph Carter, meets up with a woman who runs a bookstore, and she's supposedly a descendant of Lovecraft, and she also happens to be black. And so we kind of see writers today just saying, we reject your racism, and we're going to take the things that you thought were cool and neat, and we're just going to either destroy them, or we're going to actually have, as opposed to what Brad said, where Lovecraft presents these horrors that you can't overcome. We have heroes that are saying, yeah, we can beat this back.
And I think that actually leads very well into a story that I wanted to talk about for this. So within speculative fiction, there are several awards. One of the most prominent awards is the World Fantasy Award. This is kind of like the Oscars for speculative fiction writers. And for many, many years, the World Fantasy Award, the award itself, the physical award, was a bust of H.P. Lovecraft. It was his face. And this became a pretty problematic situation when the award was received in 2011 by Nnedi Okorafor, who is a Nigerian-American science fiction writer. She won for her book, Who Fears Death, which I think is being made into a show for HBO right now.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so she, and you guys have brought up that a lot of writers who, and fans who have read Lovecraft aren't even aware, really, of the bigotry inherent there, and she was not. But then she was shown that poem that you mentioned that is brought up in Lovecraft Country, where the racism is very explicit, very on its face. And she writes a great blog post about this that I do encourage you to read, Lovecraft's Racism and the World Fantasy Award Statuette, where she tries to deal with this. What is she supposed to think about this award now that she has it, but it's based on this very terrible person? And she wrote out to several other authors, and one of them that she received a response from, my favorite author, China Mieville, who is himself very inspired by Lovecraft and his fiction, and I really like what he said. So I'm going to quote that, if this is all right, because I think it's a very good response from China. So where does that leave the World Fantasy Award? Well, in my case, I have always done something very specific and simple. I consider the award inextricable from, but not reducible to, Lovecraft himself. Therefore, I was very honored to receive the award as a representative of a particular field of literature. And the award itself, the statuette of the man himself, I put it out of sight in my study where only I can see it, and I have turned it to face the wall. So I am punishing the little fucker like the malevolent clown he was. I can look at it and remember the honor, and above all, I am writing behind Lovecraft's back. And I really like that approach. Just as an update for everyone who is interested in this, Daniel Jose Older, who is another African-American science fiction writer, did campaign later on to change the award, and in 2015 it was changed. It is no longer a bust of H.P. Lovecraft. I was curious if the panel had any thoughts on that before we wrap things up.
You know, I remember when this was a big deal in 2011 and writing and reporting about this. And what's amazing to me was the backlash on both sides. There were people that are just like, how dare we change this award? And other people are like, are you crazy in light of all this information you know? What's really amazing is it took 4 years for them to actually change it. And that's somewhat disturbing, I think.
Just out of curiosity, what is it now?
I think it's like a pyramid with a
No,
circle
it
or
is
something
an
around it, or-
original artwork.
Is it abstract though?
Yeah, it's very. it
I
is
believe it's a
abstract.
tree with a
Okay.
sun.
All
I
right,
think
okay.
is.
Oh,
It
yeah,
was
that's what
originally
it is.
suggested that the new that it be a bust of Octavia Butler
Mhm.
instead, but I think that was moved away from as a
Here
suggestion.
it is. That's what it is now.
Oh, okay, all right.
So before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I would, just for the rest of you out there who, if you know Lovecraft, just a couple of like good reading lists from a professor thing, right? The Victor LaValle, it's a novella, The Ballad of Black Tom, is a retelling of the horror at Red Hook. One of those, Red Hook is a neighborhood in New York, and Lovecraft lived there and was like, oh my gosh, brown people, and wrote a story about it. And The Ballad of Black Tom is a retelling of that story from the point of view of an African-American character who gets drawn into it, and it's a really cool work. Also, Lovecraft Country, the Matt Ruff book, is actually, you were telling me it was originally written as a treatment for a TV series, right?
No, it was written as a book, and now it is going to
Now
be
it
an
will,
HBO
yeah.
series produced by Jordan Peele
Yeah.
of Get Out and other things.
That began shooting last July, so that's on its way. I mean, that'll probably be out probably in the spring would be my guess. I haven't heard a release date for that. Another book that I recently really enjoyed is a book called Winter Tide by Ruthanna Emrys, and that's a retelling of the Innsmouth story. At the end of the Innsmouth story, the one with the fish people, Somebody calls the FBI in, and they call in the Navy, and they send these torpedoes out to blow up the reef where the fish people live off the coast, and they round up all the fishy human being people from Innsmouth. And in that story, by the way, when you hit a certain age, like about 60 or 70, you just turn into a fish person, and then you live for hundreds of years in the ocean. And so in that story, they round up all the people from Innsmouth, and they ship them off to an internment camp. And Ruth Anna Imries has taken that story and gone with it. Her main character, who's a super cool, nice, completely, you'll like her as a protagonist. She is one of the Innsmouth people who grew up in an internment camp, and she was released because all the other Innsmouth people, except for her and her brother, they all die off because they're away from the ocean, they're away from the salt water that they need to survive. And then they've got this internment camp with nobody in it, so the Americans start loading in Japanese people at the beginning of World War II. And so she grows up with Japanese people in this internment camp with her. At the end of the war, they released the Japanese people, apparently have forgotten about the Innsmouth people, so they accidentally release the main character and her brother, and she goes on an adventure. Anyway, the whole point of the story is the Innsmouth people are actually really good people, and they are, in fact, as she keeps asserting, actual human beings, and she has to keep reminding people of this. No, I'm a human being. In it, all the business that is supposed to be bad guy stuff, the nasty monsters, are all just legitimate gods that they worship. So Yog-Sothoth is this terrible Lovecraftian monster god, and there's a cute little moment. It's not cute. It's a poignant moment, is what it is, where she's about to do something very difficult, and she's going to enter into this new part of her life. And she says, I said a little prayer for safety to Yog-Sothoth, the master of gates. And it's bizarre reading that, because here's a character who thinks of this as a benevolent being, and of course, everybody else has been trained to read it a different way. Ruth Anna Imries is clearly a huge fan of Lovecraft. Her book ties in 3 major stories better than Lovecraft ever tied his own work together. It needs probably some more editing, but I would really recommend it as a cool book to read, because it takes everything you know about Lovecraft and reverses all of it, and it's just a fun experience.
Well, I think that's amazing how writers now are taking these same themes and really showing them for what they were, and really tackling them head on. I think that's amazing, and I think it's just as good of a tactic, and probably just as effective as writing behind his back.
But it is writing behind his back,
yeah,
right?
So if anyone is interested in some of those books, we actually do have a display back there that has, for checkout, Ballad of Black Tom, Lovecraft Country, The New Cthulhu, which is a selection of short stories that examine the fiction in the same way, as well as several collections of Lovecraft's original fiction from when he was writing in the early 20th century. I want to thank our panelists for coming in today and talking to us about this complex issue, and I want to thank everyone here for being here.
Yes.
Thank you all.